The courtroom fell silent in a split second. Judge Samuel Wallace, a tall, dignified African-American man with years of experience in the legal field, stood at his desk, glaring across the room. His face was hard, his lips pressed into a thin line. The officer, Detective Mark Hudson, sat in the defendant's seat, a smug expression plastered on his face. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly not intimidated by the powerful figure before him. The air was thick with tension. "I don't know why we're even bothering with this case," Officer Hudson sneered. "It's not like this judge is going to do anything about it. Just a joke, really." He laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the courtroom. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably, but Hudson didn't care. He was used to getting away with things. His career was built on his ability to twist the law in his favor, and he had a reputation for being untouchable. He had no respect for the judge, and especially not for a black man like Samuel Wallace, who he saw as just another person in a system he had learned to manipulate. But today, something was different. Judge Wallace's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, his gaze was cold and unwavering. It was as if time had stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to break. Then, with a calm yet authoritative voice, Judge Wallace spoke. "Detective Hudson," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "you have mocked the very foundation of this courtroom. You have undermined the dignity of this court, and more importantly, you have disrespected the position I hold. It is my responsibility to ensure justice, and no matter your position or your bravado, I will make sure you understand that." For the first time, Hudson's smug smile faltered. He shifted in his chair, but still, he didn't fully grasp the weight of what was happening. He thought the judge was just speaking empty words. But then Judge Wallace's next words sent a shock through the room. "Officer Hudson," he said, "I hereby order your immediate suspension from the force, effective immediately." The room gasped. Hudson's eyes widened, and for the first time, he looked truly rattled. He stammered, trying to find words, but nothing came out. He had never in his career imagined a moment like this. The power dynamics that he had grown so accustomed to were crumbling in front of him, and he was at a loss for how to respond. The laughter that had escaped his lips moments earlier now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the stark realization that he was no longer in control. The entire courtroom was frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Would Hudson fight back? Would he lash out, knowing his career was on the line? Or would he submit to the order that had come from the very man he had mocked? Judge Wallace stood tall, his hand resting on his gavel. He had made his decision, and now there was no turning back. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, Hudson's lawyer burst to his feet, shouting, "This is outrageous. You can't do this. He's just a judge, and I demand you reconsider this ruling." Hudson's lawyer's voice was desperate, but Judge Wallace didn't flinch. His expression remained firm, unshaken. "I will not reconsider," he said coldly. "This is not about who you are or where you come from. This is about justice, and justice has been served today." And with that, the courtroom erupted into chaos. The story leading up to that moment had not been easy for Judge Samuel Wallace. He had always faced obstacles, both in his career and in his personal life. Raised in a world that often saw him as less than, Samuel had learned early on to fight for what was right, to stand tall in the face of adversity. His rise to the bench hadn't come without sacrifice. Every step had been met with opposition, whispers of doubt, and sometimes even overt hostility. But he had never let those voices deter him. They had only made him stronger. In his younger years, Samuel had witnessed injustice firsthand, growing up in a neighborhood where the legal system seemed to fail people who looked like him. He had seen friends and family members wrongly accused, punished without mercy, and their voices silenced. It had ignited a fire in him, a fire to be the change he wished to see in the world. He had put in the work, graduated at the top of his class, and made his way into law enforcement before finally becoming a judge. But not everyone appreciated his journey, and certainly not Officer Mark Hudson. Hudson was everything Samuel had hoped to never encounter in the legal world. Arrogant, dismissive, and always thinking he was above the law. Samuel had heard the rumors about Hudson's methods, using intimidation, bending the rules to suit his needs, and treating people as less than human. When Samuel had been assigned to the case involving Hudson, he knew this would be a challenge, but he hadn't expected the officer to be so blatantly disrespectful in the courtroom. It started with a simple case, a minor traffic violation, but as the trial went on, the evidence began to show something more troubling. Officer Hudson had been involved in a series of questionable actions during his time on the force, and Samuel couldn't ignore the patterns that were emerging. It wasn't just the traffic stop, it was a broader issue of misconduct. Samuel knew he had to make a stand, but he had no idea just how far Hudson would go to try and intimidate him. The officer's mockery in the courtroom had been the breaking point. As Hudson sat there, trying to regroup from the shock of the judge's order, Samuel couldn't help but feel a flicker of triumph. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. But deep down, Samuel knew this was just the beginning. He had just made an enemy in the most dangerous of places. And now, with everything on the line, he wondered if he had truly thought through the consequences of what he had just done. The courtroom was still buzzing, but in the center of it all, Judge Wallace stood motionless. He was no longer just a judge. He had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up for what was right. But would he be able to handle the fallout from this decision? Would his career survive the storm he had unleashed? Before he could even process the magnitude of the situation, Samuel was interrupted by the loud voice of his clerk. "Your Honor," she called out, "there's someone here to see you. It's urgent." Samuel turned to face her, his heart racing. Who could it be now? What more was about to unfold? He glanced over at Hudson, who was now standing, his lawyer by his side, both men looking like they were preparing for battle. But the clerk's next words were even more surprising. "It's internal affairs, Judge. They want to speak with you. Now." The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy thud, and two men entered, their dark suits a stark contrast against the light gray walls of the courtroom. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern face. The other was shorter, more compact, but equally intense. Both carried the weight of authority with every step they took. It was clear from their expressions that they weren't there for a friendly chat. As they made their way toward Judge Wallace, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again. "Your Honor," the tall man said, his voice firm but respectful, "we need to speak with you immediately." "It's about the officer. Is it about Hudson?" Judge Wallace asked, his voice barely a whisper. The shorter man nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, sir. It's worse than you think." The two men from Internal Affairs stood before Judge Wallace, their presence commanding attention. Samuel could feel the weight of the situation settling around him, a sense of foreboding that made the courtroom seem smaller, more suffocating. He didn't need to ask them why they were there. They had already made it clear. But what they said next would change everything. The taller man, who had introduced himself as Agent Richard Green, leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the judge. "Judge Wallace, we've been investigating Officer Mark Hudson for some time now. We've had reports about his conduct, allegations of abuse of power, misconduct, and worse. We've had enough evidence to take action. But what you did today, what you've just ordered." Green paused, glancing over at his colleague, Agent Laura Finch. She was quiet, her expression unreadable, but Samuel could sense the tension in the air. They were both waiting for him to respond, to say something that would either calm the storm or make it worse. "Your Honor," Green continued, "that ruling you made in court today, suspending Hudson, while it was bold and it sends a message, it complicates things. We were already preparing to make a move against him. But now things have escalated." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. "Escalated?" he asked, his voice low. "How?" Finch spoke up for the first time. "We've discovered that Hudson has connections with some very dangerous people. We've been able to trace several of his activities back to organized crime rings and corrupt officials. The issue is bigger than just him. If you go through with your suspension, if you press this case any further, he's going to fight back, and he's got powerful allies. We're talking about people with influence, people who will make this entire thing disappear." Samuel's heart raced. This was worse than he had imagined. He had known Hudson was a problem, but he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption went. The officer wasn't just some bad apple in the system. He was connected to a much larger web of crime and deceit. And now, Samuel had placed himself squarely in the middle of it. "What do you suggest I do?" Judge Wallace asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension inside him. "We don't want you to back down," Green said, his voice earnest. "But we need to handle this carefully. If you make any sudden moves, if you push too hard right now, Hudson's people will retaliate, and it'll put everyone involved in danger, yourself included. We need to proceed with caution." Samuel clenched his jaw. This was not what he had expected. He had thought that today's order would be a victory, a step toward justice. But now, with internal affairs breathing down his neck, he wasn't sure if he was in control of the situation anymore. Was this what justice looked like? Was this the kind of fight he had been preparing for all his life? Before he could respond, there was a sudden commotion in the hallway. The door to the courtroom burst open, and a police officer rushed in, his face pale, clearly out of breath. He seemed to be in a panic. "Your Honor," he shouted, eyes wide. "You need to come with us, now. It's Officer Hudson. He's gone missing." The room seemed to freeze. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. Missing? He couldn't process the words. Just moments ago, he had been face to face with Hudson, ordering his suspension. How could he have disappeared? "Missing?" Samuel echoed, his voice shaky. The officer nodded frantically. "Yes, Your Honor. We've been looking for him since just after the hearing ended. His car is gone. His apartment is empty. We don't know where he went. Did you call for backup?" Samuel asked, trying to steady his breath. "We've been trying, but there's something strange going on. It's like he vanished. No one's seen him since he left the courthouse. We're investigating, but we need your help. We think something's wrong. Very wrong." Samuel's mind raced. Hudson had been so confident, so arrogant, just moments before. Had something happened to him? Had he gone into hiding? Or was this part of a larger plan? "Get me all the details," Samuel ordered, his voice sharper now. "And make sure you keep the area locked down. I don't care who gets in your way." As the officer nodded and rushed back out, Samuel turned back to the internal affairs agents. Their faces were grim, the urgency of the situation clear. He could see the concern in their eyes, the realization that things were spiraling out of control. "What's going on here?" Samuel asked, his voice low, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Do you think Hudson was in on this from the start?" Green and Finch exchanged a glance before Green spoke. "We've suspected Hudson's involvement with organized crime for a while, but this is something different. If he's gone missing, and he's deliberately trying to avoid capture, it could mean he's working with people who are far more dangerous than we anticipated. Do you think this could be connected to the corruption in the department?" Samuel asked, his thoughts swirling. "It's possible," Finch said, her voice cold. "It's also possible that Hudson was trying to warn you, or even threaten you. Either way, we need to move fast, and we need to be careful. If we're not, we'll be playing into his hands." Samuel felt the weight of her words sink into him. This was no longer just about him, or Hudson, or even the courtroom drama they had just witnessed. This was about something much larger, a shadowy world of crime and power that was just beginning to show its true face. And he was now caught in the middle of it, with very few options for how to get out. As the agents left the courtroom to begin their investigation, Samuel remained behind, his mind reeling. He was alone in that room, but the storm was already brewing. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Just as he sat down at his desk to review the case files, a loud banging noise echoed from down the hallway. Footsteps thundered toward the courtroom. The doors swung open again, and this time, it wasn't just any officer who entered. It was Officer Hudson, standing there, bruised and bloodied, his face a mask of rage. And in his hand, he was holding something that made Samuel's stomach drop to his feet. A gun. The sight of Officer Mark Hudson standing in the doorway, holding a gun, felt like the entire world had come to a screeching halt. Judge Samuel Wallace's heart raced in his chest, the blood draining from his face as the door slammed shut behind Hudson. The sound of his boots echoed through the silent courtroom, each step deliberate and measured, as if he were fully in control of the situation. Samuel's mind scrambled to process the scene. This was not the same arrogant officer he had mocked earlier. This was someone entirely different, someone desperate, dangerous, and unpredictable. Hudson's clothes were torn, his face bruised, but his eyes were burning with fury. His hand gripped the gun tightly, the barrel pointed toward the ground, but Samuel could feel the tension in the air, the unmistakable threat of violence hanging over them. "Don't move," Hudson growled, his voice low and strained, but there was no mistaking the anger behind it. "I'm not here to make deals, Judge. I'm here to fix the mistake you made." Samuel didn't flinch, though every part of him screamed to run, to take cover, to find some way to defuse the situation. But he was a judge. He couldn't just abandon the court. He had been through tough situations before, but this was a whole new level. He knew Hudson was volatile, but this was something entirely different. Samuel's gaze flicked to the desk behind him, where the gavel rested, untouched. If he needed it, he would have to be quick. "Mark," Samuel said calmly, his voice steady, though his hands clenched under the desk. "You don't have to do this. Whatever has happened, whatever you're thinking, this isn't the way." Hudson sneered, a bitter laugh escaping him as he took a few more steps forward, circling the room like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're just like everyone else," he spat. "You think you're better than me. You think you can make orders and everyone will follow them. Well, I've got news for you, Judge. No one is above me now." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He was trying to assess the situation, trying to think of a way out. He had seen criminals in his time, people who were angry, people who wanted to lash out. But this was different. Hudson wasn't just angry. He was broken, unraveling before Samuel's eyes. There was a wildness to him, an unpredictability that made Samuel's skin crawl. "Look, Mark," Samuel said, standing slowly from his seat, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. "I understand you're upset, but this isn't the way to handle it. This isn't going to fix anything. You can't shoot your way out of this." Hudson's eyes narrowed, and he cocked his head slightly, the gun still in his hand. "Fix anything?" he repeated. "You think this is about fixing anything? No, Judge. This is about making sure you never make a decision like that again. This is about making sure everyone knows that you're not in charge here. You don't control me. You never will." Samuel's mind raced, trying to find a way to talk Hudson down, to get him to see reason. His experience in the courtroom had taught him one thing. No matter how tough the person in front of him, everyone had a breaking point. Everyone had a vulnerability. Samuel just needed to find it. The officer was twitching, his finger barely touching the trigger, his breath shallow and fast. Samuel took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Mark, listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. I know you've been through a lot, but violence, this is not the way to handle things. Let's talk about it. You're not a killer. You're better than this." Hudson's lips curled into a twisted smile, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered, stepping closer to Samuel. "You think you can lecture me on what's right and wrong? You don't know what I've seen, what I've done. This world doesn't work like you think it does. People like you sit in your cushy courtroom and pretend you can fix things. But you can't. You can't fix me. You can't fix anything. I'm already too far gone." Samuel's mind flashed back to the conversation with Internal Affairs, the warning about Hudson's ties to organized crime. He wasn't just an officer on the edge. He was part of something much darker. The fact that he had the gun and had shown up here like this made it clear that he was desperate, and desperate people did dangerous things. Hudson's voice dropped lower. "I've already been paid, you know. They don't care who gets in the way. They'll clean this up. They'll clean up everything." A shiver ran down Samuel's spine as he realized the full scope of the danger. It wasn't just about Hudson. This was about a larger conspiracy. If Hudson was telling the truth, there were people out there, powerful people, who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. "What people?" Samuel asked, his voice still steady but with a hint of urgency. "Who are you working for, Mark? Who is behind this? We can put an end to it, together." Hudson's eyes flashed with anger, and for a brief moment, Samuel thought he had pushed too far. But then the officer's expression softened. his lips twitching as if he was struggling with his next words. "Why don't you ask your friend?" Hudson growled, his eyes narrowing in the direction of the courtroom door. "Ask internal affairs what they know. Ask them what they've been hiding. You think they're here to help? They're just as dirty as I am. They're part of this." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him harder than he expected. Was it possible? Had the very people who were supposed to investigate the corruption in the department been involved all along? Before Samuel could respond, Hudson turned quickly, pointing the gun at the door. Samuel froze, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. Something was wrong. The situation was unraveling faster than he could keep up. Suddenly, the door burst open again, and two officers rushed in, their hands reaching for their weapons. But before they could react, Hudson turned his gun toward them, shouting, "Stay back! Stay the hell away from me!" The officers froze, their hands twitching toward their holsters, but neither of them dared to move. Samuel's heart was pounding in his chest as he saw the tension escalating. There was no way to stop this now without someone getting hurt. Just then, Samuel had an idea, a risky one. He needed to make Hudson see reason, to snap him out of this madness. But how? "Mark," Samuel said, his voice quieter now, softer. "If you shoot, if you go through with this, you'll never be able to undo it. You'll never have a chance to make things right. Your life will be over. But there's still time. You can still fix this." For a long moment, the room was dead silent. Hudson's finger trembled on the trigger. Samuel held his breath, praying he was getting through to the officer. But as the seconds ticked by, it was clear that Hudson was wavering, his resolve faltering. Would he listen? Or would this be the end? Before anyone could move, there was a loud bang, followed by a voice calling out from behind the officers, "Drop your weapon. Now!" The sound of the gunshot rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Samuel's heart stopped as he saw Officer Hudson's eyes widen in shock. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the possibility of violence, and yet, the loud bang was not the one they had all been expecting. Hudson's grip on the weapon loosened, his hand trembling as he turned toward the door. The officers who had entered moments earlier had stepped back, but now there was a third figure standing in the doorway, blocking their exit. It was Agent Richard Green from Internal Affairs. He had a gun in his hand, but it was pointed down, his eyes fixed firmly on Hudson, his voice commanding, "Drop it, Hudson." Green shouted again, "Drop the weapon now." For a long moment, there was no movement. Hudson stood frozen, the gun still gripped in his hand, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a guillotine ready to fall. The room was so silent, you could hear the faint sound of Hudson's labored breathing, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The rage, the desperation that had filled his eyes moments ago, was now replaced with confusion and fear. He glanced back and forth, his mind struggling to catch up with the chaos around him. Samuel stood motionless, his heart racing. He had thought that Hudson was beyond saving, that the officer was too far gone into the depths of corruption to turn back. But now, with Green's intervention, a glimmer of hope remained. "Mark," Samuel said softly, taking a step toward him, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy everything over one mistake. There's still time to fix it. Let go of the gun, please." But Hudson's gaze remained locked on Green, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance. He shook his head slightly, as if unable to believe what was happening. "You think you can just waltz in here and save the day?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "You think you can fix this? You don't know who you're dealing with. None of you do." Green's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Hudson. You're not invincible. You're not untouchable anymore. You've made too many enemies, too many mistakes. And it's time for you to face the consequences." The tension in the room was palpable. It felt like an eternity had passed in those few seconds. Samuel's mind raced. This was it. If Hudson didn't surrender, if he didn't drop the gun, there was no telling how this could end. He couldn't afford to lose this moment, not when they were so close to stopping whatever dark network Hudson had been a part of. I don't know what to do anymore," Hudson muttered, his voice trembling for the first time. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced with a flicker of vulnerability. I've lost everything. The money, the power, the connections. I thought I could control it all. But now I'm just trapped. Samuel could see it, the breaking point. The officer who had once mocked him, who had walked into that courtroom with so much confidence, was now broken, cornered, and desperate. For the first time, he wasn't just a dangerous man with a gun. He was a scared, lost individual who had made a series of terrible choices and now had no way out. "You're not trapped, Mark," Samuel said, his voice softer, more understanding. "You've made mistakes, yes, but there's still a way back. If you drop the gun, if you trust me, we can help you. You don't have to keep running. You don't have to keep hiding behind violence." Hudson's hand quivered around the grip of the gun. He glanced at Samuel, then at Green, and then at the door. His mind was clearly racing, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. For a fleeting moment, it looked like he was considering surrendering. Then, without warning, he swung the gun back towards Samuel. The action was so sudden that Samuel's heart leapt into his throat, and for a second, it felt like everything had come crashing down. But Green was faster. He fired a single shot into the air, the sound deafening. "Don't!" Green shouted, his voice filled with authority. "You won't get away with this, Hudson. Drop the gun." Hudson hesitated, his fingers still on the trigger, but his body seemed to sag under the weight of his own decisions. He stood there for a few moments, looking like a man who was about to make a choice that would change everything. His eyes darted between the gun and the two agents standing in front of him. Finally, with a sharp exhale, Hudson lowered the weapon, his shoulders sagging in defeat. His hand trembled as he let go of the gun, allowing it to fall to the floor with a metallic clatter. The room exhaled collectively, the tension easing just enough to allow a moment of breath. Green stepped forward, swiftly cuffing Hudson's wrists with practiced efficiency. The officer didn't resist. He was done. The fight was over. Samuel stood there, still processing the events that had just unfolded. His mind was reeling, but there was also a sense of relief. Hudson had been stopped, but the danger was far from over. As Green secured the officer, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far larger and far more dangerous. The door opened again, and more officers flooded the room, this time led by Agent Finch. She looked at the scene before her, nodding at Green as he finished handcuffing Hudson. "Good work," she said, her eyes briefly meeting Samuel's. "It's over for now." But Samuel knew better. This was far from over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many shadows lurking in the background. Hudson had been just one piece of the puzzle, and now that the officer was in custody, it was time to uncover the truth behind the corruption that had run so deep within the system. As Green and Finch led Hudson out of the courtroom, Samuel couldn't help but wonder what was coming next. What had he just uncovered? What had he stumbled upon in his quest for justice? And most importantly, who could he trust now? The courtroom was eerily silent after Hudson was taken away. Samuel stood at the center of the room, his heart still pounding in his chest. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. He glanced at the chair where Hudson had once sat, his mind racing with questions. Who were Hudson's allies? What kind of web had he been tangled in? And, more pressing than anything, what did all of this mean for Samuel? He had made a powerful enemy in Officer Mark Hudson, but the officer had also been a small part of something much larger, something much more dangerous. Samuel's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Agent Green and Agent Finch returned to the courtroom, their faces grim. Samuel didn't need to ask. He could already sense that they weren't bringing good news. "Your Honor," Green said, his voice low and measured. "We've taken Hudson into custody. He's being processed, but we still don't have all the answers. What we do know is, well, it's not good." Samuel nodded, his stomach twisting. He knew there had to be more. This wasn't just a simple case of one officer gone rogue. He had sensed it from the very beginning, when Hudson had acted out of character in the courtroom. There was more at play here, something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. "What's going on?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Agent Finch stepped forward. "We've been investigating Hudson for a while now. As we told you earlier, He's been involved with some very dangerous people. But it's worse than we thought. There's a network, one that spans far beyond the police department. It's a criminal syndicate with ties to organized crime, corrupt officials, and even businesses in this city. Samuel's blood ran cold. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. A criminal syndicate? A network of corruption that ran so deep within the very institutions that were supposed to uphold the law? It felt like a nightmare. Are you telling me that Hudson was just a pawn in all of this? Samuel asked, his mind struggling to process the implications of what they were saying. In a way, yes, Green replied. But Hudson wasn't just a pawn. He was a key player. He had been working with these criminals for years, using his position as an officer to protect their interests. And it seems like he was also working with someone in internal affairs. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Samuel's mind spun as he processed this new revelation. Someone in internal affairs? Someone who had been tasked with investigating corruption was now implicated in it? Who could he trust? He had no way of knowing who was working with Hudson and who was against him. Do we know who? Samuel asked, his voice tight. We don't have a name yet, Finch said, her eyes dark with concern. But we have some leads. We're going to dig deeper, find out who's involved, and take them down. But this is going to take time. A lot of time. Samuel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had always believed in justice. He had spent his life fighting for it. But now, standing in the middle of a web of deceit and corruption, he wasn't sure where to turn. He had always trusted the system, but now it felt like the system was broken. If internal affairs was compromised, who could he turn to for help? Before he could speak, Green's voice cut through his thoughts. There's more, Your Honor. The person behind all of this, the one pulling the strings, hasn't been caught yet. We don't know who they are, but we're getting closer. Samuel looked at Green, his face hardening. You're telling me there's someone even higher than Hudson, someone who's been orchestrating all of this? That's exactly what we're telling you, Green confirmed. This person is dangerous, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in their way. Which brings us to you, Judge Wallace. Samuel's stomach churned. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just exposed one of their own, and now they knew he was onto them. Me, Samuel repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. You're in danger, Finch said quietly. You made a powerful enemy today, and if they realize you're trying to bring them down, they won't hesitate to make sure you're silenced. Samuel's heart sank. His mind was racing now, the weight of everything pressing down on him all at once. He had always lived his life by the principles of justice, of fairness, of truth. But now, all of that seemed to be unraveling. How could he fight this kind of darkness? How could he face an enemy he didn't even know? I'll be fine, Samuel said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure them or himself. We'll keep going. We'll take down whoever is behind this. Green and Finch exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. They knew how dangerous the situation was. They knew how difficult the road ahead would be. But they also knew that they had no choice. They had to keep going, even if it meant risking everything. As much as I wish that were true, Green said slowly, the truth is, we don't know how deep this goes. There could be more people involved. People we haven't even suspected yet. Samuel nodded grimly. I understand. Finch stepped forward, her eyes sharp. We're putting a plan in place, but you need to stay alert. You're too close to this, Samuel. We'll do everything we can to protect you, but you need to watch your back, and you need to be careful who you trust. Samuel nodded again, his thoughts a whirlwind. The weight of the situation was crushing, and for the first time in his life, he felt small, vulnerable. But there was no turning back now. He had already made his decision to fight for justice, and he wasn't about to stop now. I'll be careful, he said, though he wasn't sure if he truly believed the words. But I can't back down. I won't let them win. Just as Green and Finch turned to leave, there was a sudden knock at the door. The clerk stepped in, her face pale. Judge Wallace, she said urgently, there's someone here to see you. They say it's important. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Who is it? He asked, his voice tight. The clerk hesitated for a moment before answering. It's someone from your past, Your Honor. Someone you might want to talk to. They say they know everything, and they want to help. Samuel's pulse quickened as he looked at the clerk. Someone from my past? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on him. Who could it be? Who could possibly know everything about him, about his life, in a way that would be worth their sudden appearance now? The clerk's gaze shifted uneasily, as if she were uncertain about what to reveal. They didn't give a name, Your Honor. But they're insistent. They said they know about your case, and they're here to help. Samuel was quiet for a moment, contemplating the situation. This wasn't the time for surprises. His life had already been thrown into chaos, with corruption lurking in every corner. His thoughts darted to the people who might have crossed his path over the years, the cases he had worked, the connections he had made, the people he had helped. Could it be someone who knew about the shady dealings in the past? Someone from a previous investigation? Samuel could feel the tension building. It wasn't every day that someone from his past just showed up without warning. And in the current climate, it could mean anything from a desperate ally to someone who wanted to silence him. He had to be careful. Send them in, Samuel said after a long pause, his voice firm. But make sure we're not being watched. If this is a trap... The clerk nodded quickly, her eyes wide. Understood, Your Honor. As she left the room to fetch the mysterious visitor, Samuel's thoughts swirled with unease. He had no idea what was coming, but he was bracing himself for anything. What had he gotten himself into? The case had turned into a nightmare, and just when he thought he was gaining some control, another unexpected twist was about to unfold. The door creaked open, and in walked a figure Samuel immediately recognized, though the years had clearly changed them. It was a man, tall, with dark, weathered features, his eyes sharp but tired. He wore a well-tailored suit, and his presence seemed to fill the room. It took Samuel only a moment to place him. Detective Elijah Thompson. Elijah, Samuel said, his voice betraying his surprise. The man before him was someone he hadn't seen in years. They had once worked together, back when Samuel had been an officer. Elijah had been a rising star in the department, known for his impeccable instincts and determination to fight corruption wherever it festered. But then, after an investigation into some shady dealings in the city, Elijah had vanished. Rumors circulated that he had been forced into hiding, but no one knew for sure. Now, here he was, standing in front of Samuel, looking every bit the part of someone who had been through hell and back. Elijah, Samuel repeated, standing up from his desk. I didn't expect this. How did you find me? Elijah gave him a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You'd be surprised what people are willing to tell you when you've been out of the game long enough. And when you've got some old friends with favors to call in. Samuel studied him carefully. You've been keeping tabs on me? Not exactly, Elijah replied, his tone steady. But when I saw the news about your recent case with Hudson, I knew something bigger was at play. I heard about your decision to suspend him, and then the rumors started. The pieces started falling into place. Samuel's mind raced. It was clear now that Elijah had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reach out. But why now? What had drawn him back into the mess? I'm glad you're here, Elijah, Samuel said slowly. But why come now? After all this time? I'm tangled up in something bigger than I thought. Something that goes deeper than just Hudson. I'm not sure anyone can help me out of this. Elijah's expression hardened. That's exactly why I'm here. Because you're right. It's not just about Hudson. It's about the bigger network he was involved in. The one that's been pulling strings for years. And if you're going to make it out of this, Samuel, you're going to need someone who knows how this game works. Samuel's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward. What are you saying? You know more than just Hudson's involvement, don't you? Elijah hesitated, his gaze flickering to the door, as if making sure they were alone. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. I've been on the inside. I had a source. Someone who tipped me off about the syndicate that's been running the show for years. You know how corruption spreads, right? Like a disease. Well, this one's been festering for a long time. Hudson was just a piece of the puzzle. The real power, the ones who are running this city from the shadows, they're much harder to find. Samuel's stomach churned as he processed Elijah's words. He had suspected there was more to this than just Hudson, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of the situation even more unbearable. Who's behind it all, Elijah? Samuel asked, his voice sharp. Who are we really dealing with? Elijah paused, clearly wrestling with the decision to share the information. Finally, he spoke, his words coming out slowly, as if they carried more danger than Samuel could understand. The man you need to watch out for, Elijah said quietly, is someone much closer to you than you realize. Someone who's been pulling the strings from within the system itself. And right now, the most dangerous thing you can do is keep going down this path without knowing who's watching your every move. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered in his chest. What do you mean? Who is it? Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a folder from under his jacket and placed it on the desk in front of Samuel. The file was thick, its contents clearly marked in bold letters. Confidential. You'll find out soon enough, Elijah said. But you have to promise me something, Samuel. Whatever you do, you have to stay one step ahead. They'll come for you next if they know you're on to them. Samuel reached for the folder, his hands trembling slightly. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the documents inside. But as he looked at the first page, he froze. The name on the top of the page hit him like a sledgehammer. Detective Mark Hudson. The file wasn't just about Hudson. It was about a much larger operation. And staring back at him from the page was a name Samuel never thought he would see. The person behind the syndicate, the one pulling the strings, was someone he had worked with years ago, someone he had trusted implicitly, and now they were the last person he would ever expect to betray him. The air in the courtroom suddenly felt stifling, as though the walls were closing in on Samuel. His breath quickened as he stared at the name on the document in front of him. His hands shook slightly as he held the folder, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The name on the page wasn't just any name. It was the name of someone who had once been his mentor, someone he had looked up to, trusted, and worked alongside in the trenches of law enforcement. It was someone who had been integral to Samuel's rise in the legal world, someone he had confided in, and now, seeing their name at the center of this web of corruption was like a punch to the gut. Who is it? Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was asking Elijah or if he was asking himself. He had to hear the answer, even though deep down, he already knew. Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Samuel carefully, his expression filled with a mixture of concern and resignation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost regretful. You don't want to hear this, Samuel, but you need to know. It's your old friend, Captain James Turner. The name hit Samuel like a freight train. Captain James Turner was a man who had been a mentor to him from the very beginning of his career. He had been there when Samuel had first joined the force, offering advice, guidance, and the kind of support that could make all the difference in the world. Turner had been a decorated officer, respected by his peers and trusted by everyone in the department. Samuel had never imagined, in a million years, that someone like Turner could be involved in something so dark. He had always seen Turner as a man of integrity, someone who stood for what was right, someone who fought for justice. But now, everything he had once believed about Turner was crumbling before his eyes. Samuel's mind raced. He didn't want to believe it. How could it be true? How could someone he had trusted so completely be the very person responsible for the corruption that had tainted everything? I don't understand, Samuel stammered, still staring at the name. Turner? But he's been a symbol of everything I've worked for. He's been a hero. Elijah's gaze softened, though it held a deep sadness. I know how you feel, Samuel. Trust me, I understand. But the truth is, Turner has been playing both sides for years. He's been working with the syndicate, feeding them information, and using his position to cover their tracks. He's been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating everything that's gone wrong in this city. Samuel felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had always admired Turner. He had trusted him with his career, with his life. And now, that trust was shattered in the worst possible way. Are you sure? Samuel asked, his voice cracking. He didn't want to believe it, but the documents in front of him didn't lie. Are you absolutely sure? Elijah nodded solemnly. I've seen the evidence, Samuel. It's all here. Turner's been in this deep for a long time, and he's not going to let you take him down without a fight. He knows you're onto him now. That's why he's going to make sure you don't survive this." The weight of Elijah's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Samuel felt his world spinning. Captain James Turner, the man who had once been his ally, was now the very person he had to bring down. It felt impossible. How could he fight someone who had been in the system for so long? Someone who knew every trick, every loophole. Turner had been untouchable, and now, it seemed, he was even more dangerous than ever. Samuel sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. He felt like he was losing control, like the walls of the world he had spent his life building were closing in on him. "You don't have much time," Samuel, Elijah said, his voice low but urgent. "Turner's been watching you. He knows you're close. And if you don't make a move soon, he's going to make sure you're out of the picture before you can get any further." Samuel took a deep breath, his mind racing as he processed the new information. He had been so focused on Hudson, on the officer who had mocked him in court, that he had failed to see the true threat standing right in front of him. Now that the pieces were falling into place, Samuel knew he had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if it meant risking everything. "I won't let him win," Samuel muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Elijah. "I can't. I've come too far." Elijah's eyes flickered with a mix of concern and respect. "I know, and I'll help you. But you have to trust me, Samuel. You have to keep your head down. Keep moving cautiously. This isn't going to be a quick fix. It's going to take time, and it's going to take everything you have." Samuel nodded slowly. He knew what Elijah was saying was true. The fight ahead of him was going to be unlike anything he had ever faced. But he had no choice. He had to bring Turner to justice, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Samuel stood up and closed the folder, locking eyes with Elijah. "What do we do next?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "First, we lay low. Turner's got eyes everywhere. We can't afford to tip our hand. I'll gather more intel, but you need to keep your guard up. The last thing we need is for Turner to find out we're onto him. The moment that happens, you'll be a target." Samuel's heart raced again, but this time it was fueled by determination. He had always believed in the law, in justice, in doing what was right. And now, more than ever, he knew that he had to keep fighting, no matter what. The battle ahead was going to be brutal, but he wouldn't back down. "Not now. I'll do whatever it takes," Samuel said firmly. "But we can't waste time. We have to act fast before Turner finds out I know." Elijah gave him a nod of agreement. "Agreed. Stay in touch. I'll be in the shadows, gathering information. But remember, this isn't a race. We can't make any mistakes." Samuel nodded, his mind already racing with the plans ahead. He knew the road wouldn't be easy. He knew that the deeper he dug into Turner's involvement with the syndicate, the more dangerous it would get. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he left the courtroom, knowing that everything was about to change. The stakes were higher than ever, and the cost of failure was too great. As Samuel stepped out into the hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. And he was right. Samuel's footsteps echoed down the cold, empty hallway of the courthouse as he made his way toward the exit. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, too many pieces to the puzzle, too many questions. He could feel the weight of Elijah's warning pressing on him, the fear that Turner would be waiting for him, already aware of what was happening. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like invisible eyes were tracking his every move. Samuel glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing behind him. The hallway was empty. Yet, he couldn't shake the sensation. Was it paranoia, or had his world truly become that dangerous? As he approached the main doors, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration startled him, and for a moment, he froze. Could it be Turner? Could the captain have already learned that Samuel was onto him? He pulled the phone from his pocket, his heart racing as he glanced at the screen. It wasn't Turner. It was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, unsure whether to answer. But something in his gut told him that this could be important, maybe even crucial to the case. He answered the call. "Hello?" Samuel said cautiously, trying to keep his voice steady. A voice on the other end, unfamiliar but calm, responded. "Judge Wallace, I have information for you. You need to listen carefully." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. The tone of the voice was direct, almost too direct. The words sent a chill down his spine. "Who is this?" Samuel asked, his voice low, wary. "That's not important right now," the voice said. "What matters is that you are running out of time. Turner knows you're after him. He's already making moves. But what you don't know is that he's about to make a bigger move, one that could end your career and your life if you don't stop it." Samuel's mind raced. His pulse quickened, and his instinct screamed that this wasn't a warning. This was someone trying to get him to act fast before it was too late. "What move? What are you talking about?" Samuel demanded. "Turner is planning to expose something you care about," the voice said cryptically. "Something personal. He's got connections in high places, people who can ruin you without leaving a trace. If you think he's just a corrupt officer, you're wrong. He's far more dangerous than you realize. He has the power to destroy everything." The call abruptly ended, leaving Samuel standing there, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind spinning with the implications. Who was that? And what was Turner planning to expose? The words personal and ruin hit him like a hammer. What did Turner know? Had he discovered something about Samuel's past, something that could be used against him? The fear that had been creeping under the surface now consumed him entirely. Samuel stood there for a moment, frozen, his thoughts racing in every direction. He had no choice now. Turner was closing in, and his plan to take him down wasn't just about the syndicate anymore. It was personal. With his heart pounding, Samuel turned and headed back toward his office. He needed answers. He needed to know what Turner was planning, what leverage he had, and how deep this rabbit hole went. As he passed the hallway security cameras, he felt that same sense of being watched. He quickly glanced up at the security monitor near the door. The screen was static for a moment, but then a figure appeared in the grainy black and white footage. It was hard to make out, but it looked like someone had just been standing there, waiting for him to pass. Samuel's stomach dropped. Was it a coincidence? Or was this another sign that someone was tracking his every move? Ignoring the unsettling feeling, he made it back to his office. His hands shook as he opened his desk drawer, retrieving the folder Elijah had given him. He spread the documents out before him, skimming through the pages with growing anxiety. His eyes locked onto a particular document, one that hadn't stood out at first glance. It was a communication from Captain Turner to an unknown recipient, a message that seemed to contain coded information. Samuel felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as he read through it. It was clear Turner had been involved with far more than just local corruption. The syndicate wasn't just a few criminals. It was a network spanning multiple cities, with ties to politicians, business leaders, and, worst of all, law enforcement officials at every level. But there was something else in the letter, a name. A name Samuel didn't recognize, but one that sent chills down his spine. Lena Morgan. The name was typed in bold, followed by a cryptic message. "She's the key. You know what to do." Samuel frowned, trying to make sense of it. Who was Lena Morgan? Why was she involved in this mess? And why had Turner singled her out? He couldn't afford to waste time figuring it out. He had to act now. He needed to find out everything he could about Lena Morgan and why Turner was targeting her. This was the only lead he had, and it could be the one thing that could unravel the entire network. As Samuel grabbed his coat and headed out of his office, his mind was already racing ahead to the next step. He needed to track down Lena Morgan. But there was no telling who she was, or what connection she had to Turner or the syndicate. One thing was certain, though. She was important, and she was in danger. He didn't know why, but he felt a deep sense of urgency. Whoever Lena Morgan was, she was the key to ending this. If he could find her, he could stop Turner's plan and put an end to the corruption that had consumed everything. But as Samuel made his way toward the exit, he didn't realize that someone was already one step ahead of him. A black SUV was parked across the street, its windows tinted dark, and in the driver's seat, a pair of cold, calculating eyes watched him closely, waiting for him to make his next move. And then, without warning, the car began to follow him. The SUV kept a safe distance behind Samuel as he walked briskly down the sidewalk, his thoughts still tangled in the mess of secrets and lies that seemed to be closing in around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, and each step he took seemed to make his unease grow. He glanced over his shoulder quickly, trying to appear casual, but the black SUV was still there, moving steadily behind him. The driver's seat was obscured by tinted windows, but Samuel could almost feel the eyes of whoever was inside on him. He quickened his pace, his heart starting to race. Was it Turner? Had he sent someone to keep tabs on him, to make sure he didn't dig too deep? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone from the syndicate? Samuel's mind raced as he rounded the corner, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. He didn't know who was behind the wheel of that SUV, but whoever they were definitely following him. He had to lose them, fast. With a quick glance to the street ahead, Samuel made a split-second decision. He ducked into an alleyway, hoping the darkness and the maze of tight, cluttered paths would obscure his movements. He heard the tires of the SUV screeching faintly as it rounded the corner after him. Whoever was following him wasn't giving up easily. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved quickly through the alley, weaving between piles of discarded boxes and crates. He had to think. He couldn't let himself be caught. He had too much to lose. Too many people were depending on him now. The sound of the SUV grew louder, but he couldn't see the vehicle yet. He pushed himself harder, moving quickly toward the next street. If he could just make it to the main road, he could disappear into the crowd. Suddenly, a car's headlights flashed in front of him, cutting through the dim alley. Samuel skidded to a stop, his heart stopping for a moment. Another vehicle had blocked his path. He could see the outline of a figure behind the wheel, and a moment later, the car door swung open. "Get in," a voice shouted. It was low, urgent. "Quick." Samuel hesitated for only a moment before realizing there was no time to question his options. The SUV was getting closer, and whoever had just pulled up was offering him an escape. Without thinking twice, he jumped into the car, slamming the door behind him. The car sped off almost immediately, the engine roaring as it peeled out from the alleyway. As the vehicle sped down the street, Samuel glanced over at the driver. His eyes widened as he recognized the man behind the wheel. It was Elijah Thompson. "You're being followed," Elijah said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "They know you're onto something. But we're not out of the woods yet. We need to keep moving." Samuel took a deep breath, his mind racing as the city passed by in a blur. "How did you find me? And how did you know they were after me?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "I've got people watching your back. You weren't being subtle, Samuel. Whoever's following you is good, but not good enough to hide from me." Samuel turned to face Elijah, still trying to process everything that was happening. He had thought he was alone in this fight, but clearly Elijah had been more involved than he had let on. "So, what now?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Where are we going?" "We need to lay low for a while," Elijah replied, his gaze shifting to the rearview mirror. "Turner's network is deep, and they're going to be looking for you now. You're a threat, Samuel, and they won't stop until you're out of the picture." Samuel felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never imagined his life would spiral out of control like this, but the reality was clear now. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about survival. As they drove, Elijah explained that there was a safe house on the outskirts of the city where they could regroup, plan their next move. It was hidden, off the grid. Exactly what they needed if they were going to stay one step ahead of Turner and the syndicate. Samuel didn't have any other options, so he trusted Elijah's judgment, though the unease in his gut didn't subside. They drove in silence for a while, the city lights fading as they moved farther away from the center. It wasn't long before the sounds of the city were replaced by the quiet of the night, the only noise coming from the hum of the car's engine. Samuel couldn't stop thinking about Lena Morgan. The name haunted him, the key to everything that was happening. Whoever she was, she had to be involved in some way. But how? And why had Turner singled her out? It was clear that she was a crucial part of this, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that finding her would be his only chance to end this nightmare. Elijah turned to him, sensing the tension in the air. "You're thinking about Lena, aren't you?" Samuel nodded. "I don't know who she is, but Turner clearly wants something from her. He's involved with the syndicate, but why her? Why now?" "We'll find out," Elijah said firmly. But you need to focus on staying alive first. Everything else can wait. If we don't figure out how to take down Turner and his people, there won't be any hope for you, for her, or anyone else caught in this. Samuel sat back in his seat, letting Elijah's words sink in. He was right. There was no time to waste. But deep down, Samuel knew that he couldn't stop now. He had to know the truth. He had to bring Turner to justice. And he had to find Lena Morgan. The safe house was hidden deep in the outskirts of the city, tucked away behind a cluster of run-down buildings, far from the watchful eyes of the authorities. It was exactly what Samuel needed: quiet, secluded, and most importantly, out of reach of Turner and his syndicate. As Elijah parked the car and they stepped out, Samuel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The weight of everything that had happened, the threats, the pursuit, the lies, was beginning to catch up with him. But there was no time to stop. Not yet. Elijah led Samuel inside, the house dark and simple, a far cry from the chaos of the city. The interior was minimalist, a few pieces of furniture scattered across the rooms, and the only light came from a dim bulb overhead. Elijah motioned for Samuel to take a seat at the table in the center of the room. "We need to lay low here for a bit," Elijah said, locking the door behind them. "But it won't be long before Turner knows we're on his tail. We'll need to be ready." Samuel nodded, his mind spinning. The mystery of Lena Morgan still gnawed at him. She was the key to it all, the missing piece of the puzzle. And now, after everything, it felt like they were running out of time to figure it out. But before he could ask Elijah more, his phone buzzed again. A new message flashing on the screen. It was from an unknown number. "They know where you are. They're coming for you." Samuel's blood ran cold. The message was clear, and the warning was unmistakable. Whoever had sent it, they were on to him, and they were already one step ahead. "This is bad," Samuel muttered, showing the message to Elijah. Elijah's face hardened as he read it, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. Turner's network runs deep. We've got to move now." Before Samuel could protest, there was a loud banging on the door. "Open up. We know you're in there." The sound sent a jolt of panic through Samuel's chest. The game had changed. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were on the verge of a full-out confrontation. Turner's men had found them. Samuel stood up quickly, heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed his coat, and Elijah did the same. They had only one option now: escape. But where could they go? How could they outrun a network of people that seemed to know their every move? Elijah moved quickly, his voice low but filled with urgency. "I have a contact who can help, but we need to get out of here fast. Follow me." Samuel didn't hesitate. He knew there was no choice but to trust Elijah. They ran through the back door and into a narrow alley behind the house, moving as quickly and quietly as possible, ducking behind shadows. The sound of footsteps grew louder, but Samuel couldn't look back. They had to keep moving. As they rounded the corner of the alley, Elijah motioned for Samuel to keep quiet. They ducked into a small, dimly lit side street where a motorcycle sat parked, its engine already running. "Get on," Elijah ordered. "I'll explain later. But for now, we're riding out of here." Samuel didn't question him. He climbed onto the back of the motorcycle, gripping Elijah tightly as they sped through the city streets, weaving between cars and taking turns at breakneck speed. The wind stung his face, but he barely noticed, consumed by the urgency of the situation. Every minute counted. They had to get ahead of Turner's men, and they had to do it quickly. They drove for what felt like an eternity, the city slowly disappearing behind them as they crossed bridges and roads that led farther and farther from where they had been. Finally, Elijah slowed down, taking a sharp turn off the main road and onto a quiet dirt path that led up to a small cabin in the woods. "This is where we'll lay low," Elijah said, as they pulled up to the cabin. "The contact I mentioned, she's here. Lena Morgan." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Lena Morgan. He dismounted from the bike, his hands shaking. Was she the one behind the messages? Had she been the mysterious source helping him all along? Elijah knocked on the door, a quick, deliberate pattern. The door creaked open almost immediately, and a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor stood before them. She was tall, with short dark hair and an air of quiet strength. Her gaze immediately locked with Samuel's, and she nodded, as though she already knew everything. "You're Samuel Wallace," she said, her voice smooth but commanding. "I know what you've been through. You've been trying to bring Turner down, and now you're here to finish it." Samuel felt a weight settle in his chest. "You're Lena Morgan." Lena nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "Yes, I've been following your moves, Judge Wallace, and I'm here to help you. Turner is dangerous, but he's not invincible. He has weaknesses, and I know how to exploit them." As Samuel stepped inside, he realized just how much he didn't know. But he had one thing now: Lena Morgan, the key to taking down Captain Turner and the syndicate once and for all. Lena closed the door behind them and took a seat at the table. "Turner's going to keep coming after you, Samuel, but we can end this. You just need to trust me." Samuel looked at her, his mind racing. For the first time in days, he felt like he was on the right track. The game had changed, and he wasn't alone anymore. Together, they could take down Turner. Together, they could put an end to the corruption that had plagued the city for so long. And with that thought, Samuel made a silent vow to himself. No matter what it took, no matter the cost, he would stop Turner. He would fight until the very end. The battle was far from over, but with Lena by his side, Samuel knew he had a fighting chance. And this time, they would win.